Gambler's Fallacy. The gambler's fallacy emerges from our mind's desperate attempt to impose order on chaos, transforming truly random events into predictable patterns that exist only in our imagination. It operates through the seductive belief that past outcomes in independent events somehow influence future probabilities, as if the universe kept score and demanded balance in its random processes. This fallacy manifests most obviously in gambling contexts, where players believe that a string of losses makes a win more likely, or that hot streaks must inevitably turn cold. The roulette wheel that has landed on black 5 times in a row seems due for red, despite the mathematical reality that each spin remains independent, with identical probabilities. The psychological mechanism exploits our pattern-seeking minds, which evolved to detect meaningful sequences in our environment. Our ancestors who could recognize patterns in animal behavior, weather changes, or seasonal cycles gained survival advantages. This same pattern detection system misfires when applied to genuinely random events, creating phantom patterns where none exist. Human intuition struggles profoundly with randomness, because truly random sequences often appear non-random to pattern-seeking minds. Random coin flips produce streaks and clusters that feel suspicious to observers expecting uniform distribution. Our brains interpret these natural clustering effects as evidence of underlying patterns or forces seeking equilibrium. The fallacy extends far beyond gambling into investment decisions, where traders believe that stocks due for reversals after trending in one direction. Sports analysis suffers similarly, with commentators speaking of players being due for good performance after cold streaks, ignoring the independence of individual plays or games. Weather prediction and natural phenomena often trigger gambler's fallacy thinking. After unusual weather patterns, people expect corrective events that restore normal conditions, misunderstanding that weather systems don't seek balance but respond to current physical conditions according to chaotic dynamics. The most sophisticated version appears in statistical analysis, where researchers or analysts expect samples to exhibit properties of entire populations, even when sample sizes remain too small for reliable inference. This statistical version of the gambler's fallacy can corrupt research findings and policy decisions based on limited data. Medical diagnostics can exhibit gambler's fallacy reasoning when practitioners expect rare diseases to be more likely after recent absence, or when they assume that multiple negative tests make positive results more probable. These expectations ignore the independence of individual diagnostic events and the stable base rates of conditions. Financial markets regularly demonstrate collective gambler's fallacy, thinking through market timing strategies based on past performance patterns. Investors expecting reversals after bull markets or crashes after periods of stability often lose money by treating independent market events as part of balancing sequences. The antidote requires developing genuine understanding of randomness and probability, accepting that independence means each event starts fresh regardless of history. This intellectual acceptance must overcome powerful intuitive resistance from minds designed to find patterns everywhere. True statistical wisdom embraces the counterintuitive nature of randomness, understanding that clustering, streaks, and apparent patterns emerge naturally from truly random processes without indicating underlying forces or future corrections. Ad hominem. The ad hominem fallacy is perhaps the most visceral of all logical errors, transforming rational discourse into personal warfare. Rather than engaging with an argument's substance, it strikes directly at the person making the claim, as if discrediting the messenger could somehow invalidate the message itself. This fallacy operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how truth works. Truth exists independently of its messenger. A profound insight can emerge from the mouth of a fool, just as dangerous nonsense can flow eloquently from the lips of a genius. Yet, the ad hominem persists because it satisfies something primitive within us, the desire to reduce complex ideas to simple judgments about people. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Identify something objectionable about your opponent, their appearance, background, past mistakes, or personal characteristics, and present this as evidence against their argument. The psychological appeal is immediate. It's far easier to dismiss someone as unworthy than to engage with the challenging work of examining their claims on merit. Consider the underlying psychology. When faced with an argument that threatens our beliefs, our minds search desperately for escape routes. The ad hominem provides the perfect emergency exit, allowing us to reject uncomfortable truths without the painful process of reconsidering our positions. It transforms intellectual confrontation into tribal warfare, where loyalty matters more than accuracy. The most insidious variants of ad hominem don't appear obviously personal. They masquerade as relevant information, questioning someone's motives, their affiliations, or their consistency in other areas. These pseudo-relevant attacks feel more sophisticated, but they remain fundamentally flawed. The genetic fallacy, rejecting ideas based on their origins, represents ad hominem's more respectable cousin, equally destructive to rational discourse. The damage extends beyond individual arguments. When ad hominem becomes normalized, it poisons the entire well of public discourse. Complex policy discussions devolve into character assassinations. Scientific findings are dismissed not on methodological grounds, but because researchers work for certain institutions. Political ideas are rejected not for their content, but because of who proposed them. The antidote requires discipline, forcing ourselves to separate the argument from the arguer, evaluating claims based on evidence and logic rather than their source. This doesn't mean ignoring relevant expertise or credibility entirely, but recognizing that even broken clocks are right twice a day. And even Nobel laureates can be spectacularly wrong outside their fields. The strawman. The strawman fallacy constructs elaborate deceptions, not through lies about facts, but through the systematic distortion of opposing arguments. Like a skilled architect of misunderstanding, it builds twisted versions of opponents' positions, versions designed to be easily demolished, while leaving the original argument unscathed, but seemingly defeated. The process unfolds with surgical precision. Take an opponent's nuanced position, strip away its complexity, exaggerate its most extreme elements, and present this caricature as their actual argument. The resulting strawman argument possesses all the structural integrity of its namesake, impressive from a distance, but collapsing at the first serious examination. What makes the strawman particularly insidious is its appearance of engagement. Unlike ad hominem attacks, which openly ignore the argument, strawman fallacies seem to address the opponent's position directly. This creates a false sense of intellectual honesty, while perpetrating a profound act of intellectual dishonesty. The psychological mechanisms behind strawman arguments reveal uncomfortable truths about human cognition. Our brains naturally simplify complex information, seeking patterns and reducing nuance to manageable chunks. This cognitive economy serves us well in many contexts, but becomes dangerous when applied to sophisticated arguments that require careful attention to detail and subtlety. Furthermore, strawman arguments satisfy our desire for easy victories. Constructing and defeating a weakened version of an opponent's position provides the psychological satisfaction of winning an argument without the difficulty of actually engaging with challenging ideas. It's intellectual masturbation, satisfying for the perpetrator, but ultimately sterile. The damage ripples outward in predictable ways. Observers witnessing strawman attacks often don't recognize the distortion, especially if they're already sympathetic to the attacker's position. They walk away, believing they've seen a legitimate argument defeated, their own biases reinforced by what amounts to an elaborate magic trick. More subtly, strawman arguments corrupt our understanding of opposing viewpoints. They create entire populations who confidently oppose positions they've never actually encountered in their genuine form. This phenomenon explains why people can hold such strong opinions about political philosophies, scientific theories, or social movements they've never seriously studied. The most dangerous strawmen don't obviously distort, they selectively emphasize. They take one element of a complex position and present it as the whole. Or they focus on the most extreme proponents of an idea while ignoring more moderate voices. These techniques maintain plausible deniability while achieving the same misleading effect. Defending against strawman attacks requires vigilance and precision. It demands that we accurately represent opposing positions before critiquing them, that we engage with the strongest versions of arguments rather than the weakest, and that we resist the seductive ease of fighting battles we're guaranteed to win. Appeal to authority. The appeal to authority fallacy represents one of reason's most sophisticated traps, exploiting our rational recognition that expertise matters while corrupting it into blind deference to credentials. It transforms the legitimate role of expert knowledge into a substitute for evidence and reasoning, creating false certainties where careful analysis should reign. Human civilization advances through accumulated knowledge, with each generation building upon the discoveries of previous experts. This creates an unavoidable dependence on authority. We cannot personally verify every scientific finding or historical claim. The appeal to authority fallacy emerges when this necessary reliance becomes intellectual abdication, when authority claims replace rather than supplement evidence-based reasoning. The fallacy manifests in multiple forms, each exploiting different aspects of our relationship with expertise. The most obvious involves citing irrelevant authority, invoking experts who lack credentials in the relevant field. When celebrities endorse medical treatments or athletes promote political positions, their fame creates an illusion of expertise that rational analysis should immediately dissolve. More subtly dangerous is the citation of relevant but insufficient authority. A single expert's opinion, no matter how qualified, cannot settle complex questions where the broader expert community remains divided. The appeal to authority fallacy treats individual expertise as infallible rather than as one important input among many in the process of knowledge formation. The psychological appeal runs deep. Authority figures provide cognitive shortcuts through complex intellectual terrain, offering the comfort of certainty without the burden of understanding. When faced with technical subjects beyond our expertise, the temptation to defer completely to authority feels not just reasonable, but virtuous, a humble acknowledgement of our limitations. This humility becomes dangerous when it transforms into intellectual passivity. The legitimate recognition that experts know more than laypeople morphs into the illegitimate conclusion that laypeople should never question expert claims. Such thinking ignores the fundamental reality that expertise exists in degrees, that experts frequently disagree among themselves, and that authority figures remain fallible human beings subject to bias, error, and corruption. The most insidious appeals to authority don't cite individuals, but invoke institutional or traditional authority. These arguments suggest that long-standing beliefs or practices must be correct simply because they've endured, or that institutional positions carry inherent truth value. Such appeals ignore the reality that institutions can perpetuate errors for decades or centuries, and that tradition often embeds historical prejudices rather than accumulated wisdom. Modern media amplifies the appeal to authority fallacy through expert shopping, the practice of finding credentialed individuals who support predetermined conclusions. In our fragmented information landscape, virtually any position can claim expert support by selecting appropriate authorities while ignoring dissenting voices. This creates false impressions of expert consensus where none exists. The antidote requires nuanced thinking about the proper role of expertise. We must learn to distinguish between appropriate deference to relevant expert consensus and inappropriate submission to individual or irrelevant authority. This means examining not just the credentials of authorities, but the strength of the evidence they present, the degree of consensus among qualified experts, and the track record of their predictions and recommendations. True intellectual humility recognizes both the value of expertise and its limitations, seeking guidance from qualified authorities while maintaining the responsibility to think critically about their claims. Slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy seduces us with vivid narratives of catastrophic progression, suggesting that modest first steps inevitably lead to disastrous final destinations. It exploits our natural tendency to think in stories, transforming reasonable caution about consequences into paralyzing fear of imaginary futures. At its core, the slippery slope fallacy conflates possibility with inevitability. It acknowledges that actions can have consequences, a reasonable observation, but then assumes that the worst possible consequences will necessarily follow, without providing evidence for this crucial causal chain. The fallacy transforms legitimate risk assessment into apocalyptic prophecy. The mechanism operates through a series of increasingly dramatic predictions, each step appearing to follow naturally from the previous one. The argument gains psychological power through accumulation. Even if each individual step seems unlikely, the story's narrative momentum makes the final catastrophe feel inevitable. Our pattern-seeking minds fill in the gaps, creating causal connections that exist only in imagination. Human psychology makes us particularly vulnerable to slippery slope arguments. Our brains evolved to detect patterns and anticipate threats, capabilities that served us well in simpler environments, but can mislead us in complex modern situations. We're naturally more sensitive to potential losses than potential gains, making worst-case scenarios psychologically more compelling than best-case alternatives. The fallacy exploits our difficulty with probabilistic thinking. Most people struggle to maintain uncertainty about future outcomes, preferring confident predictions even when evidence supports only tentative conclusions. Slippery slope arguments provide this false confidence by presenting detailed scenarios that feel concrete and specific, even when they're purely speculative. Political discourse particularly suffers from slippery slope reasoning. Policy proposals get evaluated not on their direct merits, but on imaginary chains of consequences that might follow. This creates a conservative bias against change, since maintaining the status quo requires no prediction about future consequences, while any change opens the door to slippery slope objections. The most dangerous slippery slopes don't predict obviously impossible outcomes. They extrapolate current trends to extreme but theoretically possible conclusions. These arguments maintain plausibility while still engaging in fallacious reasoning. They ignore the complex factors that might interrupt, reverse, or modify the predicted progression, treating dynamic social and political systems as simple mechanical processes. Not all slope arguments are fallacious. Some chains of consequences do occur, and wise policy considers potential downstream effects. The key distinction lies in the quality of evidence supporting each step in the proposed chain. Legitimate slope arguments provide historical precedents, logical mechanisms, and empirical evidence for their predictions. Fallacious slopes rely on fear and speculation. The antidote involves disaggregating complex predictions into individual claims that can be evaluated separately. Instead of accepting or rejecting entire chains of consequences wholesale, we must examine each link for evidence and plausibility. This approach allows us to take reasonable precautions against likely consequences, while avoiding paralysis from improbable catastrophes. True wisdom about consequences requires holding multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously, acknowledging both the potential for unintended effects and the impossibility of predicting the future with certainty. False dichotomy. The false dichotomy fallacy imposes artificial simplicity on complex realities, forcing the rich spectrum of possibilities into stark binary choices. It operates like a ruthless editor of reality, cutting away nuance and complexity until only two options remain, then demanding that we choose between them as if no alternatives exist. This fallacy exploits fundamental features of human cognition. Our brains excel at binary distinctions, friend or foe, safe or dangerous, good or bad. These rapid either-or judgments kept our ancestors alive in threatening environments. But modern challenges rarely conform to such neat categories, requiring more sophisticated analytical tools than our evolved psychology naturally provides. The false dichotomy creates artificial clarity in genuinely complex situations. When faced with multifaceted problems involving numerous variables and possible solutions, the fallacy strips away this complexity and presents just two stark alternatives. The psychological appeal is immediate complex decisions become simple choices, and the paralysis of infinite options transforms into the decisiveness of binary selection. Political rhetoric particularly depends on false dichotomies, presenting policy choices as battles between fundamentally opposed worldviews rather than technical decisions requiring careful analysis of trade-offs. This transformation serves political interests by mobilizing supporters and simplifying messaging, but it impoverishes public understanding of actual policy options. The mechanism often involves presenting two options, where many exist, but it can also work by framing issues in ways that make only certain solutions appear relevant. By controlling how problems are defined, false dichotomies shape which solutions even get considered. This makes them particularly insidious. They don't just limit our choices, but limit our imagination of what choices might be possible. Some false dichotomies emerge from legitimate practical constraints. Resources are finite, time is limited, and sometimes we must choose between competing priorities. The fallacy occurs not when such constraints exist, but when they get misrepresented or exaggerated, or when artificial urgency gets imposed to force premature decisions. The most sophisticated false dichotomies don't explicitly state that only two options exist. They simply structure arguments and present information in ways that make other possibilities seem irrelevant or impossible. These implicit false dichotomies can be harder to detect because they don't announce their limitations openly. Cultural and ideological frameworks often embed false dichotomies so deeply that they become invisible. Entire ways of thinking can rest on unstated assumptions about fundamental either-or choices that may not accurately reflect reality. These systematic false dichotomies shape not just individual arguments but entire worldviews. Breaking free requires conscious effort to seek third alternatives, fourth options, and completely different ways of framing problems. It means asking not just which of the presented options is better, but whether the question itself makes sense, whether other possibilities exist, and whether the apparent opposition between options is real or artificial. The antidote often involves embracing complexity rather than fleeing from it, accepting that many important questions don't have simple answers, and that the best solutions often combine elements from multiple approaches rather than choosing exclusively between them. Red herring. The red herring fallacy operates like a master magician, directing attention away from crucial points through elaborate diversions that seem relevant but ultimately lead nowhere productive. It exploits the natural limitations of human attention, understanding that what captures our focus determines what we think about, and what we think about determines what conclusions we reach. The term originates from the practice of dragging strong-smelling fish across trails to confuse hunting dogs, leading them away from their intended quarry. In logical discourse, red herrings serve the same function. They introduce emotionally or intellectually compelling distractions that lead discussions away from the original point of contention. Unlike other fallacies that make explicit claims, red herrings work through misdirection. They don't necessarily present false information, but rather irrelevant information that feels important. The fallacy succeeds not by convincing us of incorrect conclusions, but by preventing us from reaching any conclusions about the original issue. The psychology behind red herrings exploits our natural curiosity and our tendency to follow interesting tangents wherever they lead. Human attention is inherently distractible, a survival feature that helped our ancestors notice potential threats or opportunities in their peripheral awareness. Red herrings hijack this adaptive mechanism for manipulative purposes. The most effective red herrings don't appear obviously irrelevant. They touch on genuine issues that share some connection with the original topic. This creates a false sense of continued relevance while actually derailing the discussion. Skilled practitioners weave red herrings seamlessly into conversations, making the transition feel natural and necessary. Political discourse abounds with red herring fallacies. When pressed on specific policy failures, politicians routinely pivot to discussing their opponent's shortcomings, past achievements, or completely different issues. The diversions often address legitimate concerns, but they successfully avoid accountability for the original question. Academic and intellectual discussions aren't immune. Scholars can deploy sophisticated red herrings by introducing tangentially related theoretical frameworks, historical precedents, or methodological concerns that, while intellectually interesting, don't address the specific claims under examination. The complexity of these diversions can make them particularly difficult to recognize and redirect. The most insidious red herrings don't just change topics, they change the entire framework of discussion. They shift debates from specific factual questions to abstract philosophical ones, from practical policy considerations to ideological battles, from measurable outcomes to unmeasurable values. These framework shifts can completely transform the nature of discourse while maintaining the illusion of continuity. Modern media environments make red herring fallacies particularly dangerous. Information overload creates cognitive conditions where any plausible distraction can derail focused thinking. Social media algorithms amplify the most engaging content, regardless of its relevance, creating systematic biases toward red herring-style distractions. Defending against red herrings requires disciplined attention management. It means developing the ability to recognize when discussions drift from their original focus and the assertiveness to redirect them back to relevant issues. This doesn't mean rejecting all tangential information. Sometimes apparent diversions reveal important connections or context that genuinely illuminates the original question. The key skill involves distinguishing between relevant complexity and irrelevant distraction, between legitimate broadening of scope and manipulative misdirection. This requires maintaining clear awareness of what questions we're actually trying to answer and what evidence would be relevant to answering them. Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning represents perhaps the most philosophically elegant form of logical error, creating perfect closed systems, where conclusions and premises support each other in endless loops that generate the illusion of proof while providing none. It operates like an intellectual perpetual motion machine, appearing to create logical energy from nothing, while actually consuming the very foundation of rational discourse. The basic structure appears deceptively simple. A conclusion gets supported by premises that themselves depend on the truth of the conclusion. Like a snake eating its own tail, the argument curves back on itself, creating a closed loop where every element appears to support every other element. This circular structure can be psychologically compelling because it presents a complete, internally consistent worldview with no apparent gaps or contradictions. The psychological appeal stems from our natural preference for coherence and completion. Human minds find satisfaction in closed systems where everything fits together neatly, where questions have answers and answers reinforce each other. Circular reasoning provides this satisfaction while bypassing the difficult work of grounding beliefs in external evidence or independent verification. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous when the circular loop is large enough that the repetition isn't immediately obvious. Simple circles where A supports B and B supports A are relatively easy to detect. But complex circular arguments might involve chains of reasoning with dozens of steps, making it difficult to trace how the conclusion eventually loops back to support its own premises. Religious and ideological thinking often exhibit sophisticated circular reasoning. Sacred texts prove the existence of divine authority, which validates the sacred texts, which prove divine authority. Political ideologies explain social phenomena through their own theoretical frameworks, then point to those same phenomena as evidence for the theories. These circles can be genuinely difficult to break because they form complete, self-reinforcing worldviews. Scientific thinking specifically evolved to avoid circular reasoning through emphasis on external validation, reproducible experiments, and falsifiable predictions. Science demands that theories make testable claims about observable phenomena, preventing the closed loops that characterize pseudoscientific thinking. This methodological commitment to external validation represents one of science's greatest intellectual achievements. The most subtle forms of circular reasoning don't obviously return to their starting points. They create webs of mutual support, where multiple beliefs reinforce each other without any solid foundation. These belief networks can feel incredibly strong because every individual belief appears to have multiple sources of support, even though the entire network floats free from external anchoring. Professional expertise can sometimes mask circular reasoning. When experts in specialized fields support their claims by citing other experts who hold similar views, without ultimately grounding the entire expert consensus in independent evidence, the result resembles circular reasoning, even if no individual expert is being deliberately fallacious. The antidote requires developing intellectual habits that consistently seek external validation for beliefs and claims. This means asking not just whether our beliefs cohere with each other, but whether they connect meaningfully with evidence from outside our existing belief systems. It means being willing to trace chains of reasoning back to their ultimate foundations and examine whether those foundations rest on anything more solid than our desires for our beliefs to be true. Breaking circular reasoning often requires intellectual courage because it can threaten entire worldviews that provide psychological comfort and social identity. The process demands replacing the false certainty of closed systems with the genuine uncertainty of open inquiry. Appeal to emotion. The appeal to emotion fallacy weaponizes our deepest feelings, transforming legitimate emotional responses into substitutes for logical analysis. It operates by creating powerful emotional states that overwhelm rational evaluation, making us feel our way to conclusions rather than thinking our way there. This fallacy represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated form of logical manipulation, exploiting the complex relationship between reason and emotion that defines human consciousness. Emotions aren't inherently opposed to rational thinking. They provide crucial information about our values, motivations, and the significance of different outcomes. The fallacy emerges when emotional responses replace, rather than inform, logical analysis, when feelings become evidence rather than factors to consider alongside evidence. The mechanism operates through carefully crafted narratives, imagery, and language designed to trigger specific emotional states. Fear appeals warn of terrible consequences without providing proportional evidence for their likelihood. Pity appeals focus attention on sympathetic individuals while ignoring broader patterns or systemic considerations. Anger appeals inflame indignation about injustices while bypassing questions about proposed solutions. Human psychology makes us exquisitely vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Our brains process emotional information faster than rational analysis, creating powerful first impressions that influence all subsequent thinking. Once strong emotions are engaged, our cognitive systems shift into different modes that prioritize speed over accuracy, certainty over nuance. The most dangerous emotional appeals don't present obviously manipulative content. They embed emotional triggers within seemingly factual presentations. Statistics get selected and framed to maximize emotional impact rather than provide accurate understanding. Personal anecdotes get presented as representative evidence. Vivid imagery accompanies dry policy discussions, subtly shaping how information gets processed and remembered. Political campaigns master emotional manipulation through sophisticated understanding of psychological triggers. They know that fearful voters prefer authoritarian leadership, that angry voters support punitive policies, that hopeful voters embrace ambitious programs. Campaign messages get carefully crafted to create these emotional states, rather than provide rational grounds for political choices. The rise of visual media amplifies emotional manipulation exponentially. Television, internet videos, and social media posts can trigger immediate emotional responses before rational analysis has time to engage. The combination of imagery, music, and narrative creates immersive emotional experiences that feel more real than abstract logical arguments. Modern marketing represents emotional manipulation at its most refined, with entire industries dedicated to associating products with desired emotional states rather than functional benefits. These techniques spill over into political discourse, policy debates, and even academic discussions, where success increasingly depends on emotional engagement rather than rational persuasion. The challenge of addressing emotional appeals lies in their grain of truth. Emotions do provide legitimate information about human values and the importance of different outcomes. The question isn't whether to ignore emotions entirely, but how to incorporate them appropriately into rational decision-making processes. The antidote requires developing emotional intelligence alongside logical skills. This means learning to recognize when we're in emotionally charged states, understanding how these states influence our thinking, and developing techniques for stepping back from immediate emotional responses to engage in more reflective analysis. True wisdom integrates emotional and rational considerations rather than choosing between them, using emotions as information about what matters, while using reason to evaluate how effectively different choices serve those underlying values. Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. The Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy manufactures precision from randomness by first examining outcomes and then constructing hypotheses designed to fit those specific results. Like a gunman who fires randomly at a barn wall and then paints targets around the bullet holes to claim perfect accuracy, this fallacy creates the illusion of meaningful patterns by selecting criteria after observing data. This fallacy operates through a fundamental reversal of the scientific method, which demands that hypotheses precede data collection to prevent bias from influencing interpretation. When we examine data first and then construct explanations tailored to fit specific patterns we observe, we abandon the possibility of genuine testing and prediction in favor of retrospective storytelling. The mechanism appears straightforward, but proves psychologically compelling. Identify interesting clusters, correlations, or outcomes in complex datasets. Then construct theories or significance criteria specifically designed to highlight these patterns, while ignoring the broader context that would reveal their likely randomness. The psychological appeal stems from our powerful pattern recognition capabilities, combined with our deep need to find meaning and causation in complex phenomena. When faced with large amounts of data, containing inevitable random clusters and correlations, our minds naturally focus on the most striking patterns, while ignoring the statistical likelihood that such patterns would emerge by chance. Medical research provides frequent examples of Texas sharpshooter reasoning, where researchers might examine numerous health outcomes across multiple populations, and then focus attention on whatever correlations appear strongest, treating these post hoc discoveries as if they were pre-planned hypotheses. This approach can generate endless false correlations that fail to replicate in properly controlled studies. Financial analysis routinely exhibits sharpshooter fallacy, thinking through the practice of backtesting investment strategies. Analysts examine historical market data, identify patterns that would have generated profits, and then present these patterns as predictive strategies without acknowledging that they were selected specifically because they happen to work in that particular dataset. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in policy analysis, where complex social phenomena generate countless possible correlations and patterns. Politicians and advocates can selectively highlight whatever data points support their preferred policies, while ignoring contradictory evidence or the statistical likelihood that supportive patterns emerged randomly. Academic research faces systematic pressures toward sharpshooter reasoning through publication bias that favors positive results and novel findings. Researchers might conduct exploratory analyses across multiple variables, and then present whatever significant results emerge as if they were the original focus of investigation. The most sophisticated forms of Texas sharpshooter fallacy don't obviously select data after the fact. They use complex statistical techniques that can find patterns in almost any data set while maintaining the appearance of rigorous methodology. These approaches can generate statistically significant results that have no real-world significance. Conspiracy theories often exhibit sharpshooter fallacy reasoning by collecting vast amounts of loosely related information and then constructing elaborate explanatory frameworks designed to connect specific elements while ignoring the much larger amount of information that doesn't fit the proposed pattern. The rise of big data analytics amplifies sharpshooter fallacy risks by making it possible to identify countless correlations in massive datasets. Without proper statistical controls for multiple comparisons, such analyses can generate endless false discoveries that appear statistically significant but lack genuine predictive power. Quality journalism can fall into sharpshooter traps when reporters examine complex datasets looking for newsworthy stories, then present whatever interesting patterns they discover without adequate context about the statistical likelihood of such patterns emerging randomly. The antidote requires developing disciplined approaches to hypothesis formation and testing that resist the temptation to treat exploratory data analysis as confirmatory research. This means learning to distinguish between hypothesis generation and hypothesis testing, and insisting on independent confirmation of patterns discovered through data mining. True scientific thinking acknowledges that genuine patterns must be robust enough to survive replication under different conditions, rather than merely fitting the specific circumstances in which they were discovered. It means painting targets before shooting, rather than claiming accuracy by painting them afterward. Hasty generalization. The hasty generalization fallacy transforms limited observations into sweeping conclusions about entire categories, populations, or phenomena. It operates like an impatient scientist who announces universal laws based on a handful of experiments, or a tourist who describes entire cultures after visiting a single city. This fallacy exploits our natural pattern recognition abilities, turning a cognitive strength into an analytical weakness. Human survival has long depended on our ability to quickly identify patterns and make predictions based on limited information. Our ancestors, who could recognize dangerous situations after minimal exposure, lived longer than those who required extensive data before reaching conclusions. This evolutionary heritage makes us naturally inclined toward rapid generalization, even when circumstances call for more patient analysis. The fallacy emerges when this useful cognitive shortcut gets applied inappropriately to complex phenomena that require larger samples or more careful analysis. It manifests most obviously in stereotyping, where experiences with a few individuals shape attitudes toward entire groups. but it operates equally destructively in policy analysis, scientific reasoning, and personal decision-making. The mechanism appears straightforward. Observe a pattern in a small sample, then assume this pattern applies universally. The psychological appeal lies in the false certainty this provides. Rather than maintaining uncomfortable uncertainty about complex phenomena, hasty generalization offers confident conclusions based on whatever limited evidence happens to be available. Sample size represents only one dimension of the problem. Even large samples can support hasty generalizations if they're not representative of the broader population about which conclusions are drawn. Selection bias, temporal bias, and cultural bias can all create misleading patterns in substantial datasets, leading to confident but incorrect generalizations. The most dangerous hasty generalizations don't announce their limitations. They present conclusions with confidence that implies extensive evidence while actually resting on minimal foundations. Media reporting often amplifies this problem by highlighting dramatic individual cases without providing broader statistical context, creating false impressions about the frequency or significance of various phenomena. Personal experience particularly lends itself to hasty generalization because it feels so vivid and convincing. Our own encounters with people, places, products, or policies carry emotional weight that statistics cannot match. This creates systematic biases toward conclusions that happen to match our limited personal experience while ignoring broader patterns that might contradict it. The fallacy becomes particularly insidious when combined with confirmation bias. Once we've formed initial generalizations based on limited evidence, we tend to notice and remember information that supports these generalizations while ignoring or forgetting contradictory evidence. This creates the illusion that our hasty generalizations are being confirmed by ongoing experience. Professional contexts aren't immune to hasty generalization. Medical professionals can overdiagnose conditions they've recently encountered frequently. Investors can extrapolate short-term market trends into long-term predictions. Researchers can generalize findings from specific populations to broader groups without adequate justification. The antidote requires developing more sophisticated statistical intuitions and a deeper appreciation for the complexity of most phenomena we encounter. This means learning to distinguish between observations and conclusions, maintaining awareness of sample limitations, and resisting the psychological pressure to reach premature closure on complex questions. True analytical wisdom embraces the uncertainty that comes with limited information while still extracting whatever legitimate insights available evidence can provide. It means being willing to say, "I don't know yet," when honest analysis reveals the insufficiency of current information. Appeal to popularity. The appeal to popularity fallacy treats widespread belief as evidence for truth, transforming the sociology of opinion into the logic of reality. It operates on the seductive premise that millions of people cannot be wrong. That consensus reflects not just shared belief, but shared truth. This fallacy exploits our fundamentally social nature, turning our healthy respect for collective wisdom into unhealthy deference to collective opinion. Human beings evolved as intensely social creatures whose survival depended on group membership and cooperation. Our psychological architecture reflects this heritage through powerful conformity pressures and deep discomfort with holding minority opinions. The appeal to popularity exploits these social instincts, making majority positions feel not just safe, but correct. The fallacy manifests in countless varieties, from simple vote counting to sophisticated polling analysis. Market success becomes evidence of quality. Bestseller lists become measures of literary merit, and social media metrics become indicators of importance. Each transformation confuses the fact of popularity with the quality that might justify popularity. The mechanism appears straightforward, but operates through complex psychological channels. Popular positions carry social rewards, acceptance, belonging, and the comfort of shared identity. Unpopular positions carry social costs, isolation, criticism, and the burden of constant justification. These social pressures create systematic biases toward popular conclusions, regardless of their logical merits. Historical perspective reveals the fallacy's dangers most clearly. Popular opinion has consistently supported slavery, opposed women's suffrage, endorsed racial segregation, and rejected scientific discoveries that later proved revolutionary. The majority's track record on complex questions suggests that popularity serves as an unreliable guide to truth, even when that popularity appears overwhelming. The rise of mass media and social media amplifies the appeal to popularity through artificial impression management. Sophisticated techniques can create false impressions of widespread support for positions that actually lack genuine popularity. Astroturfing, bot networks, and selective reporting can manufacture consensus where none exists, making the appeal to popularity even more misleading than it was historically. Modern democratic societies face particular challenges from this fallacy because democratic institutions legitimately depend on popular opinion for political decisions, while truth claims require different forms of validation. This creates confusion between the appropriate role of popular opinion in political choice and its inappropriate role in factual determination. The most subtle forms of appeal to popularity don't cite explicit polls or numbers. They create impressions of consensus through language, imagery, and cultural references. Phrases like, "everyone knows," "it's obvious that," and "most people would agree," function as implicit appeals to popularity, suggesting widespread agreement without providing evidence for its existence. Professional and academic environments develop their own versions of appeal to popularity through peer pressure and institutional consensus. When entire fields share certain assumptions or approaches, these shared beliefs can feel like established truth, even when they rest primarily on professional conformity rather than compelling evidence. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous when combined with in-group dynamics. What matters isn't universal popularity, but popularity within specific reference groups, political parties, professional associations, religious communities, or social circles. These smaller consensuses can feel even more compelling than broader public opinion because they come from sources we trust and identify with. The antidote requires developing independence of judgment while maintaining appropriate respect for collective wisdom. This means learning to distinguish between questions where popular opinion provides legitimate information and questions where it represents mere social pressure. It means being willing to hold unpopular positions when evidence supports them, while remaining open to learning from widespread disagreement with our views. True intellectual independence navigates between the extremes of reflexive contrarianism and blind conformity, using popular opinion as one source of information among many rather than as a substitute for independent analysis. 2 Quoque. The 2 Quoque fallacy, literally meaning "you too," deflects criticism through accusation, transforming discussions of specific claims or behaviors into mutual recriminations that leave original issues unresolved. It operates like a distorting mirror that reflects criticism back at critics, creating the illusion that exposing hypocrisy somehow addresses the substance of their arguments. This fallacy exploits our deep psychological investment in fairness and consistency. When criticized, our natural defensive instincts search for equivalent failings in our critics, seeking to level the moral playing field through mutual accusation. The 2 Quoque provides this leveling mechanism, offering psychological relief from criticism without requiring actual engagement with its content. The mechanism appears straightforward. When someone criticizes your position or behavior, point out similar problems in their own position or behavior. This creates an implicit argument that criticism loses validity when critics exhibit comparable flaws. The psychological appeal lies in its transformation of uncomfortable defensive positions into comfortable offensive ones. However, the logical structure reveals fundamental errors. The truth or falsehood of claims exists independently of the moral standing of those making the claims. A hypocrite can still speak truth, just as a saint can still speak falsehood. Focusing on the critic's consistency diverts attention from the actual validity of their criticism. Political discourse particularly suffers from Quoque reasoning, where policy discussions routinely devolve into competitions over which side exhibits greater hypocrisy. This transformation serves the interests of those who prefer avoiding substantive policy analysis, but it impoverishes public understanding of actual governance choices and their consequences. The fallacy becomes more sophisticated when it addresses not obvious hypocrisy, but apparent double standards or selective applications of principles. These versions feel more legitimate because they highlight genuine inconsistencies in how principles get applied across different contexts. However, they still commit the fundamental error of treating consistency as more important than accuracy. Some Quoque arguments do reveal important information about motivation and credibility. When critics systematically ignore their own failings while highlighting others, this pattern suggests bias that might affect the reliability of their judgment. The fallacy emerges when such observations replace rather than supplement engagement with the substance of criticism. The most damaging forms of Quoque don't just deflect individual criticisms, they create general patterns of moral relativism, where all positions become equivalent because all involve some form of inconsistency or compromise. This universal deflection makes substantive moral evaluation impossible, reducing ethics to mere power struggles between equally flawed alternatives. International relations provide numerous examples of sophisticated Quoque reasoning, where nations deflect criticism of their policies by highlighting comparable or worse behavior by their critics. While such comparisons can provide important context about selective enforcement of international norms, they often function primarily to avoid accountability for specific actions. The rise of information warfare and partisan media has weaponized Quoque reasoning through systematic whataboutism, the practice of responding to any criticism with examples of similar behavior by opponents. This creates information environments where criticism becomes impossible, because every accusation generates counter-accusations in endless cycles. The antidote requires separating questions of hypocrisy from questions of accuracy. This means learning to evaluate claims based on evidence and logic, while separately considering issues of consistency and motivation. It means being willing to accept valid criticism from imperfect sources, while also noting patterns of bias or selective application that might affect the reliability of ongoing criticism. True intellectual honesty acknowledges that we all exhibit inconsistencies and that perfect moral standing is not a prerequisite for valid criticism. It focuses primary attention on the substance of claims, while using observations about consistency and motivation as additional context rather than decisive factors. Bandwagon Fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy represents a specific variant of the appeal to popularity, one that emphasizes momentum and social movement rather than static consensus. It exploits our fear of being left behind, our desire to be part of winning teams, and our natural tendency to follow crowds, even when we're uncertain about their destination. Unlike simple appeals to popularity that cite existing widespread belief, bandwagon fallacies emphasize growing support, increasing momentum, and the social pressure to join movements before it's too late. They transform the question, "Is this true?" into the question, "Do I want to be left behind?" This transformation proves psychologically powerful because it triggers deep evolutionary instincts about group belonging and social survival. The mechanism operates through carefully constructed narratives of increasing support and inevitable victory. Political campaigns speak of building momentum, business ventures tout rapidly growing customer bases, and social movements emphasize their expanding influence. These narratives create impressions that joining is not just popular, but necessary for social relevance. Modern marketing has refined bandwagon techniques to extraordinary sophistication. Phrases like, "Join millions of satisfied customers, don't be the last to discover," and "everyone's switching to," create artificial urgency around consumer choices. Social proof mechanisms like user reviews, subscriber counts, and social media shares provide constant feedback about what others are choosing, making consumer behavior increasingly imitative rather than independent. The psychological appeal runs deeper than simple conformity. Humans possess powerful instincts for detecting and joining successful coalitions, and capabilities that provided enormous survival advantages in ancestral environments, where being on the winning side of conflicts often meant the difference between life and death. The bandwagon fallacy hijacks these coalition detection mechanisms, making growing movements feel inherently more attractive regardless of their actual merits. Social media platforms amplify bandwagon effects through algorithmic design that rewards viral content and creates visible metrics of popularity. Trending topics, viral videos, and cascade sharing create artificial impressions of momentum that can transform fringe ideas into apparent mainstream movements overnight. These technological amplifications make it increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine grassroots enthusiasm and manufactured viral phenomena. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in financial markets, where bandwagon thinking can create speculative bubbles that divorce prices from underlying values. When investors buy assets primarily because others are buying them, rather than because of fundamental analysis, the result is crowd-driven price movements that eventually collapse when reality reasserts itself. Political movements exploit bandwagon psychology through careful staging of events that create impressions of growing support and inevitable victory. Rally sizes, endorsement announcements, and polling momentum get strategically presented to create narratives of unstoppable movements that voters should join before it's too late. These techniques can create self-fulfilling prophecies, where artificial momentum generates real support. The most insidious bandwagon appeals don't explicitly urge people to follow crowds. They simply provide constant information about what others are choosing, thinking, or doing. This creates environmental pressures toward conformity without obvious manipulation. Dating apps show user popularity metrics, news sites display most read articles, and shopping platforms highlight best-selling items, all creating subtle pressures toward bandwagon behavior. Professional environments develop sophisticated bandwagon pressures through conference trends, publication patterns, and funding priorities. Academic researchers can find themselves pursuing popular research directions, not because of intrinsic interest, but because of visible patterns of institutional support and peer attention. These professional bandwagons can distort entire fields of inquiry. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate information about collective intelligence and illegitimate pressure toward mindless conformity. Sometimes crowds do possess wisdom. Market prices can reflect genuine value. Popular movements can identify real problems, and widespread adoption can indicate genuine utility. The key is learning when collective behavior reflects thoughtful aggregation of individual judgment, and when it reflects mere imitation. The antidote requires developing independence of judgment while maintaining openness to collective wisdom. This means learning to resist social pressure while remaining attentive to information that crowds might provide. It means asking not just whether others are doing something, but whether their reasons for doing it apply to our own circumstances and values. Appeal to consequences. The appeal to consequences fallacy conflates the desirability of outcomes with the truth of claims. suggesting that beliefs should be evaluated based on their practical effects rather than their accuracy. It operates through the seductive logic that comfortable conclusions must be correct and that uncomfortable truths cannot be true, transforming wishful thinking into apparent reasoning. This fallacy emerges from the deep human need for psychologically manageable realities. When faced with potential truths that threaten our well-being, relationships, or worldviews, our minds naturally search for escape routes. The appeal to consequences provides this escape by suggesting that negative consequences somehow invalidate the claims that might produce them. The mechanism appears in multiple forms, each exploiting different aspects of our relationship with uncomfortable possibilities. Positive consequence appeals suggest that claims must be true because believing them produces beneficial results. Negative consequence appeals suggest that claims must be false because believing them would produce harmful results. Both forms substitute practical considerations for evidential analysis. The psychological power stems from our natural preference for beliefs that serve our interests and support our emotional well-being. This preference makes evolutionary sense. Optimistic beliefs can enhance performance and resilience in challenging circumstances. However, when this adaptive bias becomes a method for determining truth, it transforms useful psychology into dangerous epistemology. Religious and ideological thinking often exhibits sophisticated appeals to consequences. Arguments for religious belief frequently emphasize the comfort, meaning, and moral guidance that faith provides, rather than evidence for supernatural claims. Political ideologies get defended through their promised outcomes, rather than their factual accuracy or logical coherence. The fallacy becomes particularly insidious in policy debates, where the appeal to consequences can masquerade as practical wisdom. Opponents of research into sensitive topics argue that findings might have harmful social effects, as if the potential for misuse could invalidate factual discoveries. This creates systematic biases against investigating uncomfortable truths. Scientific progress repeatedly demonstrates the fallacy's dangers. Many discoveries that initially seemed threatening, evolutionary theory, germ theory of disease, geological age of Earth, eventually proved beneficial once their implications were properly understood. The appeal to consequences would have prevented these advances by prioritizing immediate comfort over long-term understanding. Modern therapeutic culture sometimes encourages subtle forms of consequence-based reasoning by emphasizing beliefs' psychological effects over their truth value. While mental health certainly matters, the suggestion that people should believe whatever makes them feel better represents a dangerous conflation of therapeutic utility with epistemic validity. The most sophisticated appeals to consequences don't explicitly reject inconvenient truths, they argue for suppressing, ignoring, or avoiding them. These approaches acknowledge that uncomfortable facts might be true, while suggesting that engaging with them serves no useful purpose. This creates a more subtle, but equally problematic relationship with reality. Financial decision-making frequently suffers from consequence-based reasoning, where people believe investment or economic predictions primarily because they support desired outcomes. The dot-com bubble, housing bubble, and numerous other speculative manias demonstrate how wishful thinking about consequences can override factual analysis with catastrophic results. The antidote requires developing tolerance for uncomfortable truths and separation between factual questions and practical decisions about how to respond to facts. This means learning to accept inconvenient realities while maintaining agency about how to address them. It means recognizing that truth exists independently of our preferences about truth. True wisdom acknowledges that while we cannot choose what is true, we retain significant power to choose how we respond to truth. This perspective transforms the appeal to consequences from a method for determining reality into a framework for deciding how to live within reality. Genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy dismisses ideas, arguments, or beliefs based solely on their origins, sources, or historical development, as if the genealogy of an idea could determine its validity. It operates like an intellectual genealogist who believes that family trees reveal not just ancestry, but worth, treating the circumstances of an idea's birth as decisive evidence about its truth value. This fallacy exploits our natural tendency to evaluate things through their associations and origins. Just as we might avoid food from questionable sources or distrust messengers with poor reputations, the genetic fallacy applies this reasonable caution inappropriately to abstract ideas and arguments that should be evaluated on their own merits. The mechanism appears straightforward. Identify something objectionable about an idea's origins, its historical context, the motivations of its creators, the circumstances of its development, or its early associations, and present this origin story as grounds for rejection. The psychological appeal lies in the simplicity this provides, allowing us to avoid the difficult work of evaluating complex arguments by instead focusing on more easily assessed biographical or historical information. Historical examples reveal the fallacy's dangers most clearly. Many ideas that we now accept as valuable emerged from questionable origins or were initially promoted by flawed individuals for mixed motives. Conversely, many false beliefs came from seemingly pure sources and were developed with the best intentions by admirable people. The fallacy becomes particularly subtle when dealing with ideas that do have genuinely problematic origins. When scientific research was conducted unethically, when philosophical arguments were developed to justify oppression, or when political theories emerged from corrupt motivations, the genetic fallacy can seem to provide legitimate grounds for dismissal. However, even in these cases, the origins remain separate from the validity of whatever claims emerged. Academic and intellectual discourse often exhibits sophisticated forms of the genetic fallacy through excessive attention to the social positioning, institutional affiliations, or ideological commitments of authors and researchers. While such contextual information can provide valuable perspective, it becomes fallacious when it replaces engagement with the substance of arguments and evidence. The most insidious forms of genetic fallacy don't obviously focus on origins. They create subtle associations between ideas and discredited sources, making independent evaluation more difficult. This guilt by association approach can poison entire categories of thought by linking them with extremist groups, historical atrocities, or contemporary controversies. Modern political discourse routinely employs genetic fallacies through strategic historical analogies that associate contemporary proposals with past failures or atrocities. These comparisons often ignore crucial differences between historical and contemporary contexts, while exploiting emotional associations with discredited regimes or movements. The rise of identity-based evaluation in many intellectual contexts represents a systematic application of genetic fallacy reasoning, where arguments get evaluated primarily through the demographic characteristics or social positions of those making them, rather than through their logical structure and evidential support. Commercial and marketing contexts exploit genetic fallacies through brand associations and celebrity endorsements that encourage evaluation of products based on their associations rather than their actual qualities. These techniques create systematic biases toward products with appealing origins regardless of their functional merits. The antidote requires disciplined separation between contextual information and logical evaluation. This means learning to use information about origins, motivations, and associations as background context that might inform our understanding while maintaining primary focus on evidence and reasoning that directly addresses the claims being made. True intellectual maturity acknowledges that valuable insights can emerge from anywhere, and that the most important question about any idea is not where it came from, but whether it accurately describes reality or provides useful guidance for action. No True Scotsman. The No True Scotsman fallacy protects cherished beliefs from contradictory evidence through strategic redefinition, transforming potentially falsifying examples into confirmation of original claims. It operates like a vigilant gatekeeper who ensures that only supportive examples qualify for membership in favored categories, while any problematic cases get expelled through definitional manipulation. The fallacy emerges when confronted with evidence that seems to contradict generalizations about groups, movements, or categories. Rather than acknowledging that the generalization might be incorrect or overstated, the fallacy preserves it by declaring that the contradictory examples don't truly belong to the category in question. This creates immunity from refutation through definitional flexibility. The mechanism involves a two-step process. First, make a broad claim about all members of some category. Second, when presented with counterexamples, modify the definition of the category to exclude those examples while maintaining the original claim. This allows the preservation of generalizations in the face of apparently contradictory evidence. The psychological appeal stems from our deep investment in coherent worldviews and group identities. When cherished beliefs about groups we admire or belong to face apparent refutation, the No True Scotsman provides a defense mechanism that preserves both the belief and our psychological comfort. It allows us to maintain positive generalizations while acknowledging negative examples. Religious and ideological communities particularly exhibit this fallacy when defending themselves against criticism based on the behavior of their members. Violence committed by religious believers becomes evidence that the perpetrators weren't truly religious, rather than evidence that religious belief might not prevent violence. Similarly, failed socialist experiments get dismissed as not truly socialist, rather than as evidence about socialism's practical challenges. The fallacy becomes more sophisticated when it involves genuine philosophical disagreements about essential characteristics of categories. These versions maintain plausible deniability because they can point to legitimate theoretical grounds for their definitional choices, even when those choices serve primarily defensive rather than analytical purposes. Professional and academic communities can exhibit No True Scotsman reasoning when defending their fields against criticism. Bad research gets attributed to practitioners who weren't following proper methodology, rather than acknowledged as evidence that the methodology itself might have limitations. Failed policies get attributed to improper implementation rather than flawed theoretical foundations. The most dangerous forms of this fallacy don't obviously change definitions. They reveal previously hidden definitional requirements that conveniently exclude problematic cases. These implicit definition changes can appear principled while serving primarily protective functions for favored beliefs. Political movements routinely employ No True Scotsman reasoning to distance themselves from embarrassing supporters or failed policies. Extremist behavior gets attributed to people who don't truly understand the movement's principles, while policy failures get explained through improper implementation rather than theoretical inadequacy. The fallacy can also work in reverse, where negative generalizations get protected through strategic exclusion of positive counterexamples. Groups we dislike become immune to refutation because any admirable members get reclassified as exceptions that don't represent the group's true character. Modern identity politics creates systematic pressures toward No True Scotsman reasoning, where membership in favored groups carries implications about character, intelligence, or moral standing that must be protected against contradictory evidence. This creates incentives for definitional manipulation that preserves group stereotypes. The antidote requires developing more nuanced approaches to categorization that acknowledge internal diversity within groups while maintaining meaningful distinctions between them. This means learning to hold generalizations more lightly, accepting that most categories contain significant variation rather than uniform characteristics. True intellectual honesty acknowledges that categories are tools for understanding rather than natural divisions that must be defended at all costs. It means being willing to revise generalizations when confronted with contradictory evidence, rather than revising definitions to preserve comfortable beliefs. Ludic Fallacy. The Ludic Fallacy, named after the Latin word for game, represents the dangerous assumption that real-world uncertainties can be adequately modeled using the well-defined probabilities of games and controlled experiments. It transforms the clean mathematical world of dice, cards, and laboratory conditions into a template for understanding the messy, unpredictable complexity of actual human experience. This fallacy operates through the seductive appeal of mathematical precision in an uncertain world. Games provide clearly defined rules, known probability distributions, and measurable outcomes that allow for precise calculation and prediction. The Ludic Fallacy extends this mathematical comfort zone to domains where such precision is impossible or misleading. The mechanism involves treating real-world uncertainties as if they were casino games, with known odds and well-defined rules. Financial models assume that market movements follow predictable statistical distributions. Risk assessments treat complex systems as if all possible outcomes can be enumerated and assigned probabilities. Strategic planning proceeds as if competitive environments operate according to game-theoretic principles. The psychological appeal stems from our deep discomfort with genuine uncertainty and our preference for quantified risks that feel manageable and controllable. When faced with complex situations involving unknown unknowns, the Ludic Fallacy provides the illusion of mastery through mathematical modeling, even when such modeling rests on inappropriate assumptions. The 2008 financial crisis provided a devastating illustration of Ludic Fallacy thinking, where sophisticated mathematical models treated mortgage securities as if they operated according to well-understood probability distributions derived from historical data. These models failed catastrophically because they couldn't account for the complex feedback loops, systemic risks, and unprecedented conditions that characterize the actual financial system. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in risk management contexts, where the difference between model uncertainty and real uncertainty can have catastrophic consequences. Nuclear power plant safety assessments, pandemic preparedness plans, and climate change projections all involve irreducible uncertainties that resist the kind of precise probabilistic modeling that works well for casino games. Scientific research faces constant pressure to treat complex natural phenomena as if they operated according to simple statistical models. While such modeling can provide valuable insights, the Ludic Fallacy emerges when researchers forget that their models are simplified representations rather than complete descriptions of reality. The most insidious forms of Ludic Fallacy don't obviously impose game-like thinking on complex situations. They gradually narrow attention to those aspects of reality that can be quantified and modeled, while ignoring elements that resist mathematical treatment. This creates systematic blind spots, where the most important factors become invisible, precisely because they can't be reduced to numbers. Business strategy often exhibits Ludic Fallacy reasoning through over-reliance on competitive analysis, market research, and financial modeling that treats dynamic, evolving markets as if they were static games with known players and rules. This approach can miss disruptive innovations, cultural shifts, and other factors that don't fit established analytical frameworks. Military planning historically suffered from Ludic Fallacy, thinking that treated warfare as if it operated according to predictable principles and mathematical relationships. The reality of combat involves countless variables, human factors, and emergent complexities that resist the kind of precise planning that works in wargames and simulations. The rise of big data and algorithmic decision-making amplifies Ludic Fallacy risks by creating false confidence in statistical models based on historical patterns. These systems can fail spectacularly when confronted with novel situations that fall outside their training data, or when underlying conditions change in ways that invalidate historical relationships. The antidote requires developing comfort with genuine uncertainty and learning to distinguish between situations where mathematical modeling provides useful approximations and situations where it creates dangerous illusions of precision. This means maintaining humility about the limits of quantitative methods while still using them appropriately. True wisdom about uncertainty acknowledges that mathematical models are tools for thinking rather than substitutes for judgment, that precision is not the same as accuracy, and that the most important factors in complex situations often cannot be reduced to numbers without losing their essential character. Post hoc ergo, propter hoc. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, literally meaning after this, therefore because of this, transforms temporal sequence into causal relationship, suggesting that events which follow other events must have been caused by them. This fallacy exploits one of our most fundamental cognitive mechanisms, the tendency to perceive causation when we observe consistent temporal patterns. This error represents a corruption of legitimate causal reasoning, which does require that causes precede effects in time. However, the fallacy emerges when temporal sequence becomes the only evidence offered for causal relationships, ignoring alternative explanations, such as coincidence, common causes, or reverse causation. The mechanism operates through our evolved tendency to detect causal patterns rapidly in our environment. This capability served our ancestors well when identifying which foods caused illness, which behaviors led to success, or which environmental changes predicted danger. However, in complex modern environments with countless variables and delayed effects, this same mechanism can generate false causal beliefs. The psychological appeal lies in the comfort and control that causal explanations provide. Random events feel threatening and unpredictable, while causal relationships suggest mechanisms we might understand and potentially influence. When unusual events follow other unusual events, the post hoc fallacy offers reassuring explanations, even when none exist. Medical contexts provide numerous examples of post hoc reasoning, where patients attribute health changes to whatever preceded them: dietary modifications, environmental exposures, emotional stress, or medical treatments. While some of these relationships may be genuine, many represent coincidental timing that gets interpreted as causation. Political discourse routinely exhibits post hoc fallacies when policies get credited or blamed for subsequent economic, social, or cultural changes, without adequate analysis of alternative explanations. Complex societal outcomes result from numerous interacting factors operating over different timescales, making simple before and after comparisons highly misleading. The fallacy becomes particularly insidious in business contexts, where success or failure often gets attributed to whatever management decisions preceded notable outcomes. This can lead to the adoption of ineffective strategies that happen to coincide with positive results, or the abandonment of effective approaches that preceded temporary setbacks. Superstitious behavior represents post hoc reasoning in its purest form, where individuals develop elaborate rituals based on accidental temporal associations between their actions and desired outcomes. Athletes, performers, and investors often exhibit such behaviors, maintaining practices that once preceded success, despite no logical connection. Historical analysis faces constant temptations toward post hoc reasoning, where complex historical developments get explained through whatever events preceded them, without adequate consideration of alternative causal factors. This can create misleading narratives that oversimplify the intricate web of forces shaping historical outcomes. The most dangerous forms of post hoc reasoning don't involve obvious temporal relationships, but rather subtle patterns, where alleged causes and effects are separated by extended time periods or indirect causal chains. These delayed effect arguments can be particularly difficult to evaluate because they resist simple empirical testing. Environmental and health policy debates often exhibit sophisticated post hoc reasoning, where complex phenomena like climate change, disease patterns, or ecological changes get attributed to specific human activities based primarily on temporal correlation rather than demonstrated causal mechanisms. The rise of data analytics and correlation mining amplifies post hoc fallacy risks by making it possible to identify countless temporal patterns in large datasets. Without proper controls for confounding variables and statistical significance testing, such analyses can generate endless false causal claims. Social media and viral content often exhibit post hoc reasoning by attributing cultural or political changes to specific online events, campaigns, or viral phenomena, without adequate analysis of the complex factors actually driving societal shifts. The antidote requires developing more sophisticated approaches to causal inference that go beyond simple temporal relationships to examine alternative explanations, control for confounding variables, and test predictions derived from proposed causal mechanisms. True causal reasoning acknowledges that temporal sequence is necessary, but not sufficient evidence for causation, that correlation does not imply causation, even when it involves temporal relationships, and that complex phenomena typically result from multiple interacting causes. Denying the antecedent. Denying the antecedent represents a subtle but crucial error in conditional reasoning, where the negation of a condition is mistakenly assumed to necessitate the negation of its consequence. This fallacy corrupts our understanding of logical necessity, transforming valid conditional statements into invalid biconditional assumptions that lead to false conclusions about causation and prediction. The fallacy operates through misunderstanding the logical structure of if-then statements, which establish sufficient conditions rather than necessary ones. When we know that if A, then B, we can validly conclude B when A occurs, but we cannot validly conclude that B won't occur when A doesn't occur, because other conditions might also lead to B. The mechanism appears deceptively simple, but proves psychologically compelling. Observe a conditional relationship between two phenomena, then assume that the absence of the first phenomenon guarantees the absence of the second. This transforms legitimate observations about sufficient conditions into illegitimate claims about necessary conditions. The psychological appeal stems from our natural desire for predictive control over outcomes. If we understand that certain conditions lead to specific results, we naturally want to believe that avoiding those conditions will prevent those results. This desire for control can override careful logical analysis of what conditional statements actually establish. Medical reasoning frequently exhibits this fallacy when patients or practitioners assume that avoiding known risk factors guarantees avoiding diseases. While eliminating risk factors does reduce probability of negative outcomes, it doesn't provide absolute protection because multiple independent pathways can lead to the same medical conditions. Educational contexts often involve denying the antecedent when people assume that students who don't receive specific types of instruction cannot achieve certain learning outcomes. While particular teaching methods may be sufficient for learning, they're rarely necessary, as students can often reach similar understanding through alternative approaches. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in policy analysis, where decision-makers might assume that avoiding policies known to cause problems will necessarily prevent those problems. This ignores the reality that complex social phenomena typically have multiple potential causes, making prevention more complicated than simple avoidance of known risk factors. Business strategy can suffer from this fallacy when companies assume that avoiding the mistakes of failed competitors guarantees their own success. While learning from others' failures is valuable, success typically requires positive actions beyond mere avoidance of known pitfalls. Security planning exhibits denying the antecedent reasoning when analysts assume that preventing specific types of attacks eliminates security risks. This approach can create dangerous blind spots by focusing attention exclusively on known threats, while ignoring alternative attack vectors that could achieve similar results. The most subtle forms of this fallacy don't involve obviously conditional statements, but rather implicit assumptions about necessary and sufficient conditions embedded in everyday reasoning. These hidden conditional assumptions can shape thinking in ways that aren't immediately apparent, even to careful thinkers. Scientific research faces pressures toward denying the antecedent when researchers focus exclusively on disproving specific causal mechanisms, while ignoring alternative pathways that could produce similar phenomena. This can lead to premature dismissal of effects, simply because proposed causes have been ruled out. Legal reasoning can exhibit this fallacy when lawyers assume that demonstrating the absence of specific evidence necessary for one theory of a case eliminates all possible theories. While eliminating specific causal claims is valuable, it doesn't necessarily resolve questions about what actually occurred. The rise of algorithmic decision-making systems can systematize denying the antecedent fallacies when programmers assume that avoiding inputs known to produce bad outcomes will guarantee good outcomes. This ignores the possibility of novel inputs or alternative pathways that could generate problems through different mechanisms. Environmental planning often involves this fallacy when policymakers assume that avoiding specific environmental stressors will prevent ecological problems without considering alternative sources of environmental degradation that could produce similar negative outcomes. The antidote requires developing more nuanced understanding of conditional logic that distinguishes between sufficient conditions, necessary conditions, and the complex relationships that typically exist in real-world causal systems. Equivocation. Equivocation operates through the subtle manipulation of word meanings, using the same term with different definitions at different points in an argument to create false logical connections. This fallacy exploits the inherent ambiguity of language, transforming legitimate semantic flexibility into a tool for deceptive reasoning that appears valid on the surface but crumbles under careful analysis. The mechanism depends on the fundamental reality that most words carry multiple meanings, with specific definitions emerging from context, usage patterns, and implicit agreements among speakers. Equivocation exploits this semantic richness by shifting between meanings in ways that serve argumentative purposes, while obscuring the logical gaps these shifts create. The psychological appeal stems from the apparent continuity that consistent terminology provides. When arguments use the same words throughout their development, they feel coherent and logical, even when the underlying concepts being discussed change dramatically. This linguistic consistency masks conceptual inconsistency in ways that can fool both speakers and listeners. Political discourse provides abundant examples of equivocation, where terms like freedom, justice, equality, and security get used with shifting definitions that serve different argumentative purposes. These concepts carry such rich semantic content that speakers can invoke them in multiple senses while maintaining the appearance of consistent reasoning. The fallacy becomes particularly insidious in technical and academic contexts, where specialized terminology might have precise meanings within specific disciplines, but looser meanings in general usage. Arguments can appear rigorous by using technical language, while actually shifting between technical and colloquial definitions in ways that invalidate their logical structure. Legal reasoning faces constant challenges from equivocation, where statutes, contracts, and precedents use language that can be interpreted in multiple ways. While some ambiguity is inevitable in legal language, equivocation becomes fallacious when advocates deliberately exploit multiple meanings to support conclusions that wouldn't follow from any single consistent definition. The most sophisticated forms of equivocation don't involve obvious shifts in word meaning, but rather gradual transitions where definitions evolve subtly throughout extended arguments. These semantic drifts can be difficult to detect because each individual step appears reasonable, while the cumulative effect creates logical gaps. Religious and philosophical discourse often involves complex equivocations, where fundamental concepts like existence, truth, knowledge, and reality get used in ways that shift between metaphysical, epistemological, and practical meanings. These shifts can make arguments appear profound, while actually avoiding the hard work of consistent definition. Scientific communication can suffer from equivocation when popular presentations of research use technical terms in ways that differ from their precise scientific meanings. This can create public misunderstanding about scientific findings, while giving false authority to claims that go beyond what the actual research supports. Business and marketing contexts routinely employ equivocation through terms like natural, healthy, sustainable, and innovative that carry positive associations but lack precise definitions. These terms can be used to make products or services appear to have qualities they don't actually possess. The rise of interdisciplinary research creates new opportunities for equivocation, as concepts developed in one field get applied to others without adequate attention to how their meanings might change across disciplinary boundaries. This can lead to false impressions of theoretical unity or empirical support. Social media and political messaging amplify equivocation effects by encouraging brief communications that rely heavily on emotionally charged terms whose meanings aren't clearly specified. This creates environments where equivocation can flourish because there's insufficient space for careful definitional work. Educational contexts can exhibit equivocation when curricula use the same terms to describe different learning objectives, assessment criteria, or pedagogical approaches without clearly distinguishing between these different uses. This can create confusion about what students are actually expected to learn or demonstrate. The antidote requires developing sensitivity to the multiple meanings that important terms can carry and insisting on definitional clarity in contexts where precision matters. This means learning to recognize when arguments depend on consistent word usage and demanding that such consistency be maintained throughout their development. Appeal to tradition. The appeal to tradition fallacy elevates historical practice to the status of logical argument, suggesting that the age or persistence of beliefs and practices provides evidence for their truth or value. This fallacy transforms the legitimate recognition that traditions often embody accumulated wisdom into the illegitimate assumption that longevity alone validates ideas regardless of their actual merits. This fallacy operates through our deep psychological connection to continuity, belonging, and inherited wisdom. Human societies depend on cultural transmission of knowledge, values, and practices across generations, creating natural reverence for traditional ways of thinking and acting. The appeal to tradition exploits this healthy respect for heritage by extending it beyond its appropriate bounds. The mechanism appears straightforward. Identify long-standing beliefs or practices, then argue that their persistence demonstrates their correctness or value. The implicit logic suggests that if something were truly wrong or harmful, it would have been abandoned over time, while beneficial practices would naturally persist through selective cultural evolution. The psychological appeal runs deeper than mere respect for the past. Traditional beliefs and practices provide psychological anchoring in an uncertain world, connecting individuals to larger communities and historical narratives that extend beyond their personal experience. Challenging traditions can feel like rejecting these vital connections to meaning and identity. However, historical analysis reveals the fallacy's dangers. Many persistent traditional practices have proven harmful, ineffective, or morally objectionable when subjected to careful scrutiny. Slavery, subjugation of women, religious persecution, and countless other traditional practices persisted for millennia, not because they were beneficial, but because they served the interests of powerful groups or were protected by cultural taboos. The fallacy becomes particularly problematic in rapidly changing technological and social environments, where traditional approaches may be genuinely obsolete. Educational methods, medical treatments, business practices, and governance structures that worked in historical contexts may prove inadequate for contemporary challenges. Religious and cultural contexts provide the most obvious examples of appeal to tradition reasoning, where ancient beliefs and practices get defended primarily on grounds of their antiquity rather than their contemporary relevance or empirical support. While traditions often contain valuable wisdom, their age alone cannot establish their truth or appropriateness for current circumstances. Legal systems exhibit sophisticated versions of this fallacy through excessive deference to precedent that prioritizes consistency with past decisions over adaptation to new circumstances or correction of past errors. While legal stability has genuine value, blind adherence to traditional interpretations can perpetuate injustices and prevent necessary legal evolution. The most insidious forms of appeal to tradition don't explicitly invoke historical authority, but rather present traditional viewpoints as natural, obvious, or commonsensical, without acknowledging their historical contingency. These approaches make traditional perspectives appear universal, rather than culturally specific. Business organizations often suffer from traditionalist thinking that resists innovation and adaptation based on appeals to established practices, company culture, or industry norms. This can prevent necessary changes in response to competitive pressures, technological developments, or changing consumer preferences. Academic disciplines can exhibit traditionalist biases through curricula, research methods, and theoretical frameworks that persist primarily because of their historical prominence, rather than their current utility or accuracy. This can slow scientific progress and prevent needed paradigm shifts. The challenge lies in distinguishing between traditions that embody genuine wisdom worth preserving and traditions that persist primarily through habit, power, or resistance to change. This requires evaluating traditional practices on their contemporary merits rather than assuming that historical persistence demonstrates current value. The antidote involves developing balanced approaches that respect the potential wisdom embedded in traditions while maintaining willingness to modify or abandon practices that no longer serve useful purposes. This means treating tradition as one source of information among many, rather than as definitive evidence for truth or value. True wisdom about tradition acknowledges that human societies have developed many valuable practices over time, while also recognizing that historical persistence can result from factors other than actual merit. False analogy. False analogy corrupts the legitimate use of analogical reasoning by drawing comparisons between situations that differ in crucial respects, leading to conclusions that appear logical but rest on fundamentally flawed similarities. This fallacy exploits our natural tendency to understand new situations through comparison with familiar ones, transforming a valuable cognitive tool into a source of systematic error. Analogical reasoning serves essential functions in human thinking, allowing us to apply knowledge from familiar domains to unfamiliar situations, generate creative solutions to novel problems, and communicate complex ideas through accessible comparisons. The false analogy fallacy emerges when these legitimate uses of comparison ignore significant differences between situations being compared. The mechanism operates through selective attention to surface similarities, while ignoring deeper structural differences that undermine the analogy's validity. False analogies highlight features that make compared situations appear equivalent, while downplaying or ignoring aspects that make them fundamentally different in ways relevant to the conclusions being drawn. The psychological appeal stems from the cognitive economy that analogies provide. Understanding complex new situations requires significant mental effort, while analogies offer shortcuts that make unfamiliar phenomena feel manageable by connecting them to familiar experiences. This cognitive efficiency becomes dangerous when it replaces careful analysis with superficial comparison. Political rhetoric routinely employs false analogies by comparing contemporary situations to historical events in ways that highlight dramatic similarities while ignoring crucial differences in context, scale, technology, or social conditions. These comparisons can generate powerful emotional responses while providing little, genuine insight into current challenges. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in policy debates, where complex social, economic, or international situations get compared to simpler historical precedents or domestic experiences that differ in fundamental ways. Such analogies can lead to inappropriate policy responses based on lessons that don't actually apply to current circumstances. Legal reasoning faces constant temptations toward false analogy through the case-by-case development of precedent that requires comparing current situations to past decisions. While analogical reasoning is essential to legal consistency, false analogies can extend legal principles beyond their appropriate scope or apply them to situations that differ in legally significant ways. Scientific thinking must guard against false analogies that compare complex natural phenomena to simpler mechanical or familiar systems in ways that obscure rather than illuminate their actual operation. While scientific models often depend on analogical thinking, false analogies can impede understanding by suggesting inappropriate theoretical frameworks. The most sophisticated false analogies don't present obviously inappropriate comparisons, but rather highlight genuine similarities while subtly minimizing crucial differences. These partial analogies can feel compelling because they contain elements of truth while leading to false conclusions about the aspects where the analogy breaks down. Business strategy often relies on analogical reasoning to apply successful approaches from one market, industry, or competitive situation to another. False analogies can lead companies to pursue strategies that worked elsewhere but are inappropriate for their specific circumstances, competitive environment, or organizational capabilities. Educational contexts frequently employ analogies to help students understand difficult concepts by comparing them to more familiar phenomena. While such pedagogical analogies can be valuable, false analogies can create lasting misconceptions by suggesting inappropriate conceptual frameworks that students carry forward to more advanced study. Medical reasoning can suffer from false analogies when practitioners apply treatment approaches or diagnostic frameworks from familiar conditions to similar appearing but fundamentally different medical situations. This can lead to inappropriate treatment decisions based on superficial symptom similarities rather than underlying pathophysiological differences. The rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning creates new categories of false analogy as people compare algorithmic decision-making to human cognition in ways that ignore fundamental differences in how artificial and biological intelligence systems actually operate. International relations analysis routinely exhibits false analogies that compare current global situations to historical precedents without adequate attention to changed technological, economic, or political conditions that make historical lessons inappropriate guides for contemporary policy. Appeal to nature. The appeal to nature fallacy assumes that natural phenomena, processes, or substances are inherently superior to artificial or human-created alternatives, transforming descriptive observations about what occurs in nature into prescriptive claims about what ought to be valued or pursued. This fallacy exploits our evolved psychological biases toward natural environments while ignoring the complex relationship between naturalness and value. This fallacy operates through the implicit assumption that nature represents an ideal standard against which human creations should be measured and typically found wanting. It treats the distinction between natural and artificial as morally or practically significant in ways that extend far beyond the specific contexts where such distinctions might actually matter. The mechanism appears through selective valorization of natural phenomena while ignoring natural processes that would be considered harmful or undesirable if they occurred in human contexts. The fallacy highlights appealing aspects of nature while downplaying natural selection's brutality, environmental catastrophes, disease, and countless other natural phenomena that humans reasonably seek to avoid or modify. The psychological appeal stems from several sources: our evolutionary heritage in natural environments, romantic idealization of pristine wilderness, cultural narratives about humanity's fall from natural grace, and legitimate concerns about unintended consequences of technological intervention in complex systems. However, the fallacy emerges when these psychological and cultural biases transform into logical arguments that treat naturalness itself as evidence of superiority. The reality is that natural phenomena can be beneficial, harmful, or neutral, depending on specific contexts and human values, while artificial interventions can similarly range from helpful to destructive. Marketing and consumer culture extensively exploit appeal to nature fallacies through products advertised as natural, organic, chemical-free, or traditional, without providing evidence that these characteristics actually make them superior to alternatives. Such marketing creates false impressions that naturalness guarantees safety, effectiveness, or environmental responsibility. Medical and health contexts frequently exhibit appeal to nature, reasoning through preferences for natural treatments, remedies, or lifestyle approaches over scientific medicine. While some traditional practices have genuine therapeutic value, their effectiveness stems from their actual biological mechanisms rather than their natural origins. The fallacy becomes particularly problematic in environmental and sustainability discussions, where complex ecological and technological questions get reduced to simplistic preferences for whatever appears more natural. Effective environmental protection often requires sophisticated technological interventions rather than simple return to pre-industrial practices. Agricultural debates often involve false appeals to nature that idealize traditional farming methods while ignoring their limitations in terms of productivity, sustainability, and environmental impact. While industrial agriculture certainly creates problems, solutions require careful analysis of specific practices rather than blanket assumptions about natural superiority. Parenting and education contexts can exhibit appeal to nature fallacies through assumptions that children's natural development should proceed without adult intervention or guidance. While respecting children's developmental processes is important, effective education and socialization require deliberate cultural transmission rather than simple natural unfolding. The most sophisticated forms of this fallacy don't explicitly invoke naturalness, but rather embed preferences for natural approaches within apparently scientific or rational arguments. These disguised appeals to nature can influence thinking without being immediately recognizable as fallacious reasoning. Dietary and nutrition discussions routinely involve appeal to nature fallacies that assume foods closer to their natural state are automatically healthier than processed alternatives. While processing can certainly reduce nutritional value or introduce harmful additives, the relationship between processing and health is complex and requires specific analysis rather than general rules. Technology policy debates often exhibit appeal to nature biases that treat technological intervention as inherently problematic compared to allowing natural processes to continue unchanged. While precautionary approaches to new technologies are often wise, effective policy requires evaluating specific risks and benefits rather than applying blanket preferences for naturalness. Fallacy of the single cause. The fallacy of the single cause reduces complex phenomena that result from multiple interacting factors to simple explanations involving single causal agents, creating misleading impressions about how complex systems actually operate. This fallacy exploits our cognitive preference for simple, comprehensible explanations, while ignoring the intricate webs of causation that characterize most important real-world phenomena. This fallacy operates through our natural tendency to identify primary or proximate causes, while neglecting the broader causal networks that make these primary causes effective. It transforms legitimate observations about important causal factors into illegitimate claims that these factors alone explain complex outcomes that actually result from multiple necessary conditions working together. The mechanism involves selecting one particularly salient, dramatic, or ideologically convenient factor from among many contributing causes, and then treating this single factor as if it were sufficient to explain the entire phenomenon. This creates false impressions of simplicity and control while obscuring the actual complexity of causal relationships. The psychological appeal stems from several sources. Our cognitive limitations in processing multiple simultaneous causal factors, our desire for actionable explanations that suggest clear intervention points, and our need for narratives that assign responsibility and meaning to complex events that might otherwise seem random or inexplicable. Historical analysis routinely exhibits single-cause fallacy reasoning when historians attribute complex historical developments to individual leaders, single events, or particular social forces, while ignoring the multiple interacting factors that actually shaped historical outcomes. While highlighting important causal factors serves legitimate analytical purposes, treating them as sole causes creates misleading historical understanding. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in policy contexts, where complex social problems get attributed to single causes that then become targets for policy intervention. Educational failure, crime, poverty, health disparities, and environmental problems all result from multiple interacting factors, making single-cause explanations both inaccurate and counterproductive for policy development. Medical reasoning can involve single-cause thinking when practitioners or patients attribute health outcomes to single factors like genetics, lifestyle choices, environmental exposures, or medical treatments, while ignoring the complex interactions among multiple biological, behavioral, and environmental factors that actually determine health outcomes. Business analysis often exhibits fallacy of the single cause reasoning when managers attribute company success or failure to single factors like leadership, market conditions, product features, or competitive strategies, while overlooking the multiple variables that actually influence business performance in competitive markets. The most insidious forms of single cause fallacy don't obviously claim that one factor explains everything, but rather systematically emphasize one causal factor while downplaying or ignoring others that might be equally important. This creates biased understanding that appears sophisticated while actually oversimplifying complex causal relationships. Personal relationship and psychological contexts can involve single-cause thinking when people attribute relationship problems, personal struggles, or behavioral patterns to single factors like childhood experiences, personality traits, or recent events, while ignoring the multiple influences that shape human behavior and relationships. Economic analysis sometimes exhibits single-cause fallacy reasoning when analysts attribute economic phenomena like inflation, unemployment, growth, or inequality to single factors like monetary policy, technology, globalization, or government regulation, while ignoring the complex interactions among multiple economic forces. Criminal justice analysis can involve single-cause thinking when investigators, policymakers, or the public attribute crime patterns to single factors like poverty, education, family structure, or law enforcement approaches, while overlooking the multiple social, economic, psychological, and situational factors that actually influence criminal behavior. The rise of media coverage that emphasizes dramatic individual stories can amplify single-cause fallacy effects by focusing attention on particular causal factors that make compelling narratives while neglecting broader systemic factors that might be more important but less dramatically interesting. Scientific research faces pressures towards single cause, thinking through publication bias that favors studies, identifying clear causal relationships, while making it difficult to publish research that documents complex multi-causal phenomena. or negative results that fail to identify single clear causes. The antidote requires developing more sophisticated causal thinking that can hold multiple contributing factors in mind, simultaneously, recognizing that most important phenomena result from complex interactions among necessary but insufficient causes, rather than single sufficient causes. True causal sophistication acknowledges that while identifying important causal factors is valuable, understanding complex phenomena requires appreciating the intricate networks of causation that make single factors effective, and that effective intervention often requires addressing multiple causal pathways rather than focusing exclusively on single causes. Affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent represents a fundamental error in conditional reasoning that reverses the logical relationship between sufficient and necessary conditions, transforming valid observations about outcomes into invalid conclusions about their causes. This fallacy corrupts our understanding of logical implication by assuming that the presence of expected consequences proves the presence of hypothesized antecedent conditions. The fallacy operates through misunderstanding the asymmetric nature of logical implication in conditional statements. While knowing that if A, then B allows us to conclude B when we observe A, it does not allow us to conclude A when we observe B, because many different conditions might lead to the same outcome. The mechanism appears deceptively reasonable. Observe an outcome that a particular theory or cause would predict, then conclude that this observation confirms the theory or demonstrates the presence of the cause. This backward reasoning feels logical because it involves outcomes that genuinely would follow from proposed causes, but it ignores alternative explanations that could produce identical results. The psychological appeal stems from our natural desire for confirmation and our tendency to notice evidence that supports our preferred explanations while overlooking alternatives. When we observe outcomes consistent with our theories, affirming the consequent provides satisfying confirmation that feels more substantial than it actually island. Medical diagnosis frequently involves temptations toward affirming the consequent when practitioners observe symptoms that would be consistent with suspected conditions, and then conclude that these symptoms confirm the diagnosis. While symptom consistency is relevant evidence, many different conditions can produce similar symptoms, making such reasoning potentially misleading. Scientific research must guard against affirming the consequent when experiments produce results consistent with theoretical predictions. While such consistency provides some support for theories, it doesn't prove them correct, because alternative theories might make identical predictions, or the results might have emerged through different mechanisms than those proposed. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in policy analysis when decision-makers observe outcomes consistent with policy predictions and then conclude that their policies were effective. Complex social phenomena typically have multiple potential causes, making it impossible to attribute specific outcomes to particular policies without controlling for alternative explanations. Criminal justice contexts can exhibit affirming the consequent reasoning when investigators observe evidence consistent with particular theories about crimes and then treat this consistency as proof of those theories. While consistency with evidence is necessary for valid theories, it's not sufficient because multiple different scenarios might explain the same evidence. The most subtle forms of this fallacy don't involve obviously backward reasoning, but rather gradual accumulation of confirmatory evidence that feels increasingly compelling while actually providing less proof than it appears. This can create false confidence in conclusions that rest on affirming the consequent rather than genuine logical support. Business analysis often involves affirming the consequent when companies observe market outcomes consistent with their strategic assumptions and then conclude that their strategies were correct. While positive outcomes are obviously preferable, they don't necessarily validate the reasoning that led to strategic decisions, because success might result from factors other than those originally considered. Historical analysis faces constant temptations toward affirming the consequent when historians observe outcomes consistent with particular explanatory frameworks and then treat these observations as confirmation of their historical theories. Complex historical developments typically admit multiple explanations, making confirmation more difficult than it initially appears. The rise of data analytics amplifies affirming the consequent risks through correlation analysis that identifies patterns consistent with causal theories, without providing adequate evidence for the proposed causal mechanisms. Statistical relationships can appear to confirm theories, while actually reflecting entirely different underlying processes. Educational assessment can involve affirming the consequent when educators observe student performance consistent with particular pedagogical theories, and then conclude that these theories have been validated. While performance outcomes matter, they can result from numerous factors beyond the specific teaching approaches being evaluated. Quality control in manufacturing and service industries can exhibit this fallacy when managers observe outcomes consistent with process improvements and then conclude that specific changes were responsible for observed improvements. Complex systems typically involve multiple variables that can influence outcomes in ways that make attribution more difficult than simple before and after comparisons suggest. The antidote requires developing more sophisticated approaches to causal inference that go beyond simple consistency between predictions and outcomes, to examine alternative explanations, control for confounding variables, and test distinctive predictions that would differentiate between competing theories. True logical sophistication acknowledges that observing expected consequences provides weak evidence for proposed causes, that multiple different causes can produce identical effects, and that strong causal claims require evidence that rules out plausible alternative explanations rather than merely demonstrating consistency with preferred theories. Conjunction fallacy. The conjunction fallacy leads people to judge specific combinations of events as more probable than the individual events that compose them, violating fundamental principles of probability theory through the psychological appeal of detailed, coherent narratives that feel more plausible than simpler alternatives. This fallacy exploits our tendency to confuse representativeness with probability, making conjunction scenarios feel more likely when they match our expectations or stereotypes. This fallacy operates through the representativeness heuristic, where probability judgments get influenced more by how well scenarios match mental prototypes than by actual mathematical relationships between events. When detailed descriptions create vivid mental images that align with existing beliefs or stereotypes, people can judge these complex scenarios as more likely than the simpler events they contain. The mechanism involves presenting scenarios with multiple specific details that make them feel concrete and plausible, while obscuring the mathematical reality that adding additional conditions always reduces probability, never increases it. The psychological appeal of coherent stories overwhelms logical analysis of probabilistic relationships. The psychological foundation rests on several cognitive biases: our preference for detailed, specific information over abstract probabilities, our tendency to use representativeness as a shortcut for probability assessment, and our difficulty with mathematical reasoning about compound events, especially when they're embedded in compelling narratives. Classic experimental demonstrations involve scenarios like judging whether someone is more likely to be a bank teller or a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement. When the description emphasizes characteristics that seem consistent with feminist activism, people often judge the conjunction as more probable than the simple category, violating basic probability principles. The fallacy becomes particularly problematic in risk assessment contexts, where detailed disaster scenarios can seem more likely than the broader categories of adverse events they represent. This can lead to overestimation of specific risks that match vivid mental images, while underestimating more general but actually more probable categories of problems. Financial decision-making often involves conjunction fallacy reasoning when investors judge specific market scenarios as more likely than broader market categories, because detailed scenarios feel more concrete and predictable. This can lead to overconfidence about particular investment strategies, while underestimating more general market risks. Medical contexts can exhibit conjunction fallacy thinking when patients or practitioners judge specific diagnostic scenarios as more likely than broader disease categories, because detailed symptom patterns create compelling narratives that feel more probable than simpler diagnostic possibilities. The most sophisticated forms of conjunction fallacy don't involve obvious probability errors, but rather subtle preferences for detailed explanations and predictions over simpler alternatives that are actually more likely to be accurate. These preferences can influence everything from strategic planning to scientific theorizing. Legal reasoning can involve conjunction fallacies when juries judge specific crime scenarios as more likely than broader categories of criminal behavior, because detailed narratives create compelling stories that feel more believable than simpler explanations of evidence. Intelligence analysis and security assessment often exhibit conjunction fallacy reasoning when analysts construct detailed scenarios about potential threats that feel more plausible than broader threat categories, potentially leading to misallocation of security resources towards specific but actually less probable risks. The rise of data analytics and scenario planning can amplify conjunction fallacy effects by encouraging the construction of detailed predictive models that feel more accurate than simpler alternatives, while actually being less likely to be correct due to their increased specificity. Political analysis and polling can involve conjunction fallacies when commentators judge specific electoral scenarios as more likely than broader political outcomes, because detailed narratives about particular combinations of events feel more plausible than simpler predictions about general trends. Business strategy often exhibits conjunction fallacy thinking when managers construct detailed success scenarios that feel more achievable than broader business objectives, because specific action plans create illusions of control and predictability that obscure underlying uncertainties. Marketing and consumer research can exploit conjunction fallacy effects by presenting detailed product benefits or usage scenarios that feel more compelling than simpler value propositions, even though the complex scenarios are necessarily less likely to occur than their component parts. The antidote requires developing better intuitions about probability relationships, particularly the mathematical reality that conjunctions of events are always less likely than their individual components, regardless of how plausible or representative the combined scenarios might appear. True probabilistic thinking acknowledges that detailed scenarios can provide valuable insights for planning and analysis, while recognizing that their specificity makes them less likely to occur exactly as described, and that simpler predictions often prove more accurate than complex ones, despite feeling less satisfying intellectually.